Have you ever sat quietly in your favorite chair, hands resting in your lap, and asked yourself, when did the distance begin? Not the physical kind, the kind where your grown child looks right at you, but doesn't see you. The kind where days slip by without a phone call, weeks without a visit. The kind where you're no longer asked, no longer included, just slowly forgotten in the rhythm of their busy lives. It sneaks up on you, doesn't it? One moment, they were small and always underfoot. They needed you for everything: food, advice, comfort, even permission to go outside. And you gave it all freely, without hesitation, because that's what love does. But now they have their own world, their own routines, their own silence. And you, once the center of their orbit, have become background noise. Faint, familiar, easy to ignore. Maybe you felt it in little things. The hurried tone in their voice, the short responses to your texts, the way they promise to stop by next weekend, but then next weekend never comes. There's a particular ache in being emotionally left behind by your own children. It's not loud, it doesn't scream, but it lingers. It walks with you through the house. It sits with you at dinner. It lays beside you at night. You wonder, quietly, did I do something wrong? And maybe, just maybe, there's been a moment alone in your room, folding the same shirts you folded for years, when you thought about calling and saying something, saying anything, but you stopped yourself. You didn't want to sound needy. You didn't want to push them further away. So you waited. You told yourself they're busy. They'll come around. But the waiting, it wears on the soul. Let me tell you something gently, because it matters. If your children are avoiding you, pulling away in subtle or not so subtle ways, the answer isn't to beg, it isn't to plead, and it certainly isn't to shrink into guilt or shame. The answer is quiet strength, the kind that doesn't chase, but stands, the kind that doesn't demand, but radiates. There was a woman named Emily, soft-spoken, kind-hearted, always the peacemaker. She raised 3 boys with her whole soul, made every birthday cake from scratch, stayed up late sewing costumes, went without vacations, so they could go to summer camps. Years later, her boys grew up, moved out, and slowly moved on. They still loved her, they said, but it was distant love, convenient love, the kind that shows up in birthday cards, but not in real conversations. At first, Emily tried harder. She baked their favorite cookies and dropped them off without being asked, sent texts with articles she thought they'd enjoy, left voicemails filled with cheerful updates, pretending not to notice they weren't returned. But every effort felt like throwing a pebble into a vast, empty lake, until one evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea, she realized something profound. She had given them everything except the example of how to treat her with respect. In her effort to be endlessly giving, she had unintentionally taught them that her time, her presence, her love came with no boundaries. That night, she made a quiet decision not to stop loving them, but to stop reaching for them from a place of fear. The next day, she did something small but powerful. She stopped waiting by the phone. She went to the market, bought herself a bouquet of lilies, and arranged them with care. She poured herself a glass of wine, put on her favorite music, and danced barefoot in the living room. She chose herself not to punish them, but to remember her own worth. You see, there is something quietly transformative about no longer seeking validation where it isn't freely given. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you begin healing. And healing begins with attention not to them, but to you. There's a man named Caleb. Vidover, soft eyes, strong hands. He used to sit by his window every afternoon, watching for his son's car. He'd even leave the porch light on just in case. But the visits grew fewer, the excuses longer, and one day, his son didn't come at all. It crushed him. For days, he felt like nothing, like an afterthought in his own family. But then Caleb did something beautiful. He picked up his late wife's old camera, dusted it off, and began photographing birds in his backyard. It gave his hands something to do, his eyes something to look for, his heart something to soften around. And eventually, he shared a photo on social media. His son saw it, commented, then called. Not because Caleb had guilted him, but because he had become visible again in a new way. not from begging, from being. You don't have to remind your children who you are. You only need to remember it yourself. When you do, the world begins to shift. Maybe not right away. Maybe not even in the way you imagined. But something always moves when you root yourself in quiet dignity. So if you've felt the cold edge of distance from your child, if you've swallowed your hurt just to keep peace, if you've been slowly disappearing in their eyes, please don't disappear in your own. You are not a burden. You are not a problem to fix. You are a living, breathing soul who still has a story to tell, beauty to witness, peace to create. You don't need to beg for love. You need to be loved to yourself first. That's where it all begins. It's easy to lose yourself in the silence, especially when it's the silence of someone you once held in your arms. When the distance grows, and the calls stop, and the birthdays feel more like reminders than celebrations. The quiet can feel like a verdict, as if somewhere along the way, you failed. But that's the cruelest lie aging tells us, that distance equals worthlessness. The truth is, sometimes the gap between parents and children isn't caused by something you did wrong. Sometimes it's simply life sweeping them up in a tide of busyness, distractions, unhealed wounds they don't know how to talk about. And sometimes it's their own unresolved guilt that makes them stay away. None of that is about your value. But here's what is within your hands: what you allow, how you respond, and where you place your attention now. Let me tell you about Frank. He's 73, worked with his hands all his life, raised 2 daughters on his own after their mother passed. He was the kind of father who never missed a school concert. Even when he was bone-tired from working a double shift, he made sure they always had warm meals, clean clothes, and someone to come home to. But once they grew up and moved away, something began to shift. The phone calls turned into texts, then the texts came less often. When he finally asked his eldest if he could visit, she paused and said, "Dad, I'm really overwhelmed right now." He said, "Okay." But that night, he sat on the edge of his bed, stared at the floor, and felt a grief that had no name. It wasn't just about being lonely. It was about feeling erased. And for a while, Frank shrank. He stopped going to the diner. He let his garden go wild. He told himself, maybe this was just what getting older meant, learning to live with being forgotten. But one morning, something changed. He woke up early, made coffee, and sat outside before the sun rose. As the sky turned soft and golden, a thought came to him, not loud, but certain. "I may be alone," he whispered, "but I'm not empty." That morning, Frank did something small. He made a list of things he used to enjoy, not with anyone else, just by himself. Fishing, whittling wood, reading war history, fixing old radios. He picked one whittling and went out to the shed to find his tools. That was the beginning. He didn't do it to post online. He didn't do it hoping his daughters would notice. He did it because it brought him back to himself. And when you return to yourself, something shifts. Emily, remember her? With the lilies and the dancing in her living room, she started taking slow walks in the park each morning. At first, it was just about movement. But eventually, she began to nod at the same faces, smile at a woman walking her dog, wave at the gardener. They smiled back. She wasn't doing anything grand. She was simply being present. And in that presence, people noticed her. Not because she begged for attention, but because she carried herself with quiet grace. That's what people forget about dignity. It's not about being proud or distant. It's about treating yourself the way you wish others would treat you. It's about standing up straighter when no one's looking, speaking kindly to yourself in the mirror, buying flowers not because company's coming, but because you are. When your children avoid you, there's a natural urge to try harder, to make them feel guilty, to remind them of everything you gave. But guilt never grows love, and reminders rarely bring back connection. What does make a difference is your energy, your steadiness, your ability to exist joyfully, even without applause. It's the mother who laughs over her tea while listening to the birds instead of waiting by the phone. It's the father who sharpens his tools for no one but himself. It's the grandmother who begins writing her stories down, not to impress, but to remember. Grace, a retired librarian, used to journal every evening. She'd write about the sky, the people she passed, the way the leaves changed. Her daughter hadn't visited in 6 months. Grace stopped sending invites, not out of anger, but out of acceptance. Instead, she began living the kind of day she would have loved to share. A slow breakfast, a chapter of her favorite book, a walk around the lake, warm soup, an old movie, and each night, she'd write. Today was enough. 2 months later, her daughter showed up unannounced. She noticed the flowers, the soup simmering, the calm on her mother's face. "You seem good," she said, almost surprised. Grace smiled and replied, "I am." Her daughter stayed for dinner that night, not because she felt guilty, but because she remembered who her mother was. Not the woman waiting to be needed, but the woman simply being herself. When you stop trying to fix what's broken in others, and instead nurture what's whole in you, they notice. They don't always say it, but they feel it. They feel the steadiness, the peace, the quiet strength. You don't have to be loud to be remembered. You don't have to be needed to be valuable. You don't have to beg to be loved. You only have to come home to yourself, because once you do, everything else begins to fall into place. Maybe slowly, maybe differently than you imagined, but always with more dignity than begging could ever offer. It's a strange sort of power, isn't it? The kind that doesn't roar, doesn't demand, doesn't even ask for attention. It just is quiet, steady, and sure of itself. That's the kind of presence you start to build when you stop chasing approval and begin living with intention. Not for them, not for recognition, but because you have a life still worth living and you choose to live it. Helen, an 80-year-old with the softest smile and a sharp wit, had spent years wondering what went wrong. Her son had grown distant after his second marriage. Helen tried everything: gifts, invitations, offers to babysit. Nothing seemed to bridge the gap. She often found herself wondering if her son's new life just didn't have room for her anymore. She spent too many holidays waiting, too many Sunday dinners with an extra place set that never got used, too many nights replaying old memories like a movie she couldn't stop watching. Then one day, she sat at her kitchen table, ran her hand along the tablecloth she had ironed earlier that morning, and she whispered, "I'm done waiting." Not in bitterness, in peace. She folded the tablecloth and put it away. She made herself a lovely dinner and lit a candle. She took out her knitting needles and began a scarf for herself. Not for a birthday or a baby shower or anyone else, just for her. Each stitch became a reclaiming, a quiet thread pulling her back to herself. She didn't stop loving her son. She simply stopped tying her joy to his behavior, and slowly, something happened. Her posture changed. Her eyes softened. She laughed more easily with neighbors. She began attending a book circle on Thursday nights, and even hosted one herself. And then, months later, her son came by, not because she called him, not because she asked, but because he had seen something change. He said she looked lighter. What he meant was, she had returned to herself. That's what happens when you let go of the need to be needed, and instead, embrace the desire to be whole. And this doesn't mean your children will suddenly become the warm, attentive people you hope they'll be. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes their silence has nothing to do with you. Sometimes their absence is about wounds they carry, fears they haven't faced, or simply being lost in their own lives. But the beautiful part is, you don't have to live in response to their absence. You get to live in the presence of your own life. Caleb, the man who took up bird photography, once said something simple but powerful. The birds still come whether my son calls or not. That's the truth of it. The sun still rises. The kettle still boils. The leaves still turn red in autumn. And you are still here. You don't need to disappear just because someone else has looked away. You can still light candles, play music, tend to your plants, take walks in the quiet morning, send letters, wear colors that make you smile, bake cookies and eat them warm, with no one else around. Not because you're proving something, but because this is still your life. And when you begin to live that way, with your own peace as your foundation, you become magnetic, not in a flashy way, but in a soulful, grounded, deeply human way. Ryan, a retired postal worker, spent years trying to mend the distance between himself and his daughter. She had grown critical over the years, always finding fault. Every visit left him feeling small. At first, he tried to explain himself. Then he tried being quiet. Then he tried being funny. None of it worked. Eventually, he realized something difficult but freeing. He couldn't fix how she saw him. He could only change how he saw himself. He began to treat himself the way he once hoped she would. He spoke gently to himself after a long day. He cleaned his home with care, not for guests, but because he deserved a clean, warm space. He bought a new jacket after wearing the same one for over a decade, not because anyone would notice, but because he finally decided he was worth it. And slowly, the sadness that once weighed him down began to shift. He still wished things were different, but he no longer felt broken, and that was everything. Sometimes, the deepest healing isn't in fixing the relationship. It's in refusing to let the brokenness define you. You may never get the apology you deserve. You may never hear the words you long for, but you can create a life so rich with meaning that those longings lose their grip. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to prove to be respected. You don't need to shrink to be loved. You need only to stand in your quiet light and say, "This is who I am, and it is enough." That's not pride, and that's peace. And peace has a way of reaching others, sometimes even those who've drifted far without force, without guilt, without needing to chase, because love that is rooted in self-respect is unshakable. So if your child calls tomorrow, you will greet them with grace, and if they don't, you will still water your garden, pour your tea, and live your life with a full and open heart. You are not defined by who shows up. You are defined by how you show up for yourself. Thank you for staying with me through this quiet, powerful reflection. I know this topic carries weight, not the kind people always see, but the kind you feel in your chest at the end of a long day. The kind that whispers when you're alone, asking questions you wish you didn't need to ask. Questions like, why did they stop calling? Do they think of me? Did I do too much or not enough? If any part of this message touched something inside you, please know this. You're not alone in these feelings. And more importantly, you are not broken. You are not unlovable, and you are not at fault for how someone else chooses to show up or not. You are still here. Still worthy of joy, still full of stories, of tenderness, of strength. And even if your children don't see that right now, you can and you must. Because when we stop chasing love that doesn't meet us with the same open heart, we make space for something richer, something slower, something true. A life that doesn't beg for attention, but breathes with meaning. A life that doesn't wait for someone else to fill the silence, but sings softly into it. You've done so much for others, perhaps more than you ever received in return. But now, this chapter, this season is yours. It is not selfish to honor yourself. It is not wrong to choose peace over guilt. It is not cold to create a boundary that protects your light. This is your time to come home to yourself. And if you've found comfort in these words, I'd love to know, how have you learned to cope with distance in your family? Has your relationship with your adult children changed over time? What helped you find strength when the silence grew too loud? Please share your story in the comments. You never know who might read your words and feel less alone because of them. This space, here, is more than just a video. It's a circle, a quiet room filled with voices that understand. And your voice matters in that room. And if this message made you feel seen, if it gave you even one breath of relief, I'd be honored to keep walking beside you. You can click subscribe if you'd like to stay connected. That way, whenever you need a gentle reminder, a quiet truth, or just someone to say, "You're not invisible," I'll be here. No big promises, just honest moments. Because that's what this part of life deserves. Not noise, not performance, but truth and softness and dignity. So wherever you are right now, whether the house is full or quiet, whether you're feeling strong or tender, I hope you take a moment today to do something just for you, not to earn love, not to fix anything, just because you matter and you always have. Until next time, take care of your heart, speak kindly to yourself, and live gently but fully. You're not forgotten, you are becoming, and you are deeply, quietly loved.